Perfect. Hi, everyone. This is our conclusive webinar for our first series on the Ajyal Podcast. I'll just give a quick run of show for our audience, just so that we know what's happening. Um, we'll just give a brief introduction to Youth for Nature. I think, and I presume that most of our audience knows or they know Youth for Nature. Then we give a quick introduction to the Ajyal podcast. Why did we come up with this podcast? What's the purpose of it? And then we'll just give a very quick reminder of the topics that we discussed with our guests here on the Ajyal podcast, our first series, Climate Justice in West Asia. And then Rania Masri will be giving 15 to 20 minutes of an elaborative discussion on the issue of climate justice in West Asia. And then we'll jump directly to the discussion, which should last about 30 minutes. And so all of this should take about 40 to 50 minutes maximum. And this is meant for you, the audience, to come up, have an open discussion with our guests and with an expert on the topic, so that we can talk about this issue much more, because it's very needed in our region, especially by youth. All right, so there's nothing new to learn here. Of course, we're gonna learn together by discussing, but there's nothing to be presented specifically, all right? This is about you, the audience, having the chance to discuss this further, because we know that this topic is, or all of these topics that we discuss are kind of hot topics in our region, and people like to bring them, they like to bring them up more often. So Youth for Nature. Youth for Nature is a youth-led, climate-focused NGO based in British Columbia and Canada. And we focus on three main pillars or three main topics: nature-based solutions. We focus on indigenous rights to nature, which has a lot to do with what we're going to talk about today. And lastly, the topic of climate justice. And part of this is that we're trying to create a generation that is able to, or we're trying to create youth who can be leaders and stewards for nature. This is what we're trying to do through knowledge sharing, through storytelling, and through capacity building. The Ajyal podcast is part of our knowledge sharing pillar at Youth for Nature. And we decided to host this podcast to discuss specifically youth priorities and the nature and climate space. So what do you think regarding policies for nature and climate in West Asia specifically? What do they demand? What are the challenges that they face, whether it's social or environmental? And what is their call to action for decision makers around the Arab world, but also on a global level? This is a space for youth to discuss this very openly regarding the topics that we think are a bit sensitive, but need to be discussed further. All right, and so we came up with our first series, Climate Justice in West Asia, and we began our first episode with Ala and Lama, and we spoke about the effect of militarization in Syria and Yemen on climate movements, because we see a lot of climate movements around the world. Greta is all over Sweden. She's doing all the riots. What's happening in West Asia? We want to know what's happening here. Where are the youth of West Asia? Why aren't they being able to have that momentum that Greta has in Europe or others in North America or in the Western world? What are the challenges, specifically the social challenges that they are facing that are, not allowing them to have that big momentum they need to have? And so that's why we had this. We spoke about militarization in Syria and Yemen. And then we had Nishad. Nishad and I spoke about, is there a balance between oil and economic growth in the Gulf region and climate action? We know that the regimes in the Arabian Gulf don't allow or don't foster that youth expression on the ground of demands, especially for climate justice. We know that there are ambitious actions or plans being taken by the government, but we want to hear what youth have to say, what kind of criticism do they have, or what kind of ambitions do they have personally. And, we also focus on greenwashing. So, we know that a lot of oil companies, they're promoting tree growth somewhere or tree planting in some part of the world, but at the same time, they're still burning fossil fuels. So where's the balance here, which is something we call greenwashing or co-option. And then the last episode we had with Suha Jarrar from Al-Haq organization in Palestine, is not here with us today, but we spoke about the Palestinian struggle mainly and how occupation is denying the Palestinian the ability to achieve climate justice, specifically in Palestine, because that is at the heart of climate justice in West Asia, the Palestinian struggle. So those were the topics of the climate justice series. And yeah, all right, before we go to Rania, maybe all of our guests who are with us on the podcast could give a 30-second introduction to themselves, just because I couldn't do that. So let's start with Ala, we'll go back, and then we go to Lama, Nishad, and then Rania, you can take the floor and begin, all right? Ala, can you please introduce yourself in 30 seconds?
Okay, thank you, Rian. Hi, everyone. I'm Ala Mustafa from Yemen. I work as a global ambassador for West Asia in Youth for Nature, and I'm happy to be with all of you here. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. This is Lama Ranjous. I am the Middle East Ambassador for Water Science Policy and a member of AYCM Syria. Very nice to be with you today.
Hi, I'm Nishad. I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of Arab Youth Climate Movement again in Qatar, and also steering committee of Global Shapers, Climate and Environment, as well as UNESCO steering committee for youth on climate change. Great to have you all today.
All right, Rania, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, it's good to be with you all. Let me briefly introduce myself just to tell you who I am. I'm a trained political ecologist, so I look at environmental issues within the framework of political ecology, which is a different framework to use than looking at simply environmental issues from a neoliberal economic perspective or from a strict science perspective. A political ecology framework recognizes the deep linkages, deep links between science and public health and economics and political science, so on and so forth. I also led the regional work. By regional, I mean specifically the Arab region on environmental justice research. And you can see our work on ejatlas.org. And our work has been translated into Arabic and Turkish and numerous other languages as well. So thank you for inviting me to this webinar. And I'm thrilled that Youth for Nature actually has these three pillars: nature-based solutions, indigenous rights to nature, and climate justice. Because actually the first two pillars are the solution for the third one. If we take nature-based solutions and we recognize indigenous rights to nature, then we would be on the right path to actually resolving the climate injustices that we have. So I'm thrilled that Youth for Nature actually has those pillars. But this specific webinar is to look at climate justice in West Asia. I'm thrilled also that you've used the term West Asia and not the very problematic Orientalist term of the Middle East. So thank you for not using the term MENA. So when we use the term climate justice, what is it that we actually want? Those of us that are from West Asia, those of us that are concerned with this region, what does that term actually mean to us? What does even the term climate action mean to us? I'm going to use a very non-controversial individual in quoting climate justice, and that non-controversial individual is Mary Robinson, who is no stranger in the world of politics or human rights and is internationally recognized, and as well as being the former president of very dear Ireland. She defines climate justice, and I quote, "Climate justice insists on a shift from a discourse on greenhouse gases and melting ice caps into a civil rights movement with the people and communities most vulnerable to climate impacts." So if that is a mainstream definition of climate justice, what does it actually mean then when we look at climate action? And how do we then organize for climate justice within our regions? So what actually is climate action? Are we working to raise awareness for the sole effect of raising awareness? What is the objective of raising awareness, and within what situation do we strive to raise awareness? I'll give you a really bad example of climate action. There was one of the climate movement organizations in Lebanon several years ago, and they were striving to raise awareness on the impacts of climate change on Lebanon. The first mistake that they did is they falsely presented information. They claimed that climate change would cause a sea level rise in Beirut, and there's absolutely no evidence that climate change will cause a sea level rise in Beirut. It could cause enormous desert storms, enormous storms that would put the depression that used to take place on the northwestern United States and the midwestern United States, that was discussed very powerfully in numerous pieces of literature by John Steinbeck, it would put that to shame, possibly. But there is no research about sea level. So there was that one problem that they did. But more fundamentally, at a time when Lebanon was going through immense political and economic turmoil, nothing even like the dangers that we're going through now, here comes an organization that wants us to raise awareness about climate change by talking about what could happen in the future regarding sea level, when currently, at that time, we were running out of water. So there was a complete disconnect here. And there's a further issue, which is you want, or at least this organization wanted us to raise awareness on climate change, even though Lebanon is one of the victims and is not one of the guilty parties. So what would it mean for countries that are facing the injustice of climate change to be held responsible as if we were the main culprits behind climate change? So what are we actually raising awareness for? And I'm thrilled, Ryan, that you brought up greenwashing in your introduction, because we had another environmental organization that actually took money from Coca-Cola in Lebanon to plant trees. And the environmental organizations that I work with were appalled at this, because Coca-Cola is notorious for stealing water from indigenous communities, as well as is notorious for killing union organizers in Colombia. So in no way should we participate in any kind of greenwashing or whitewashing with such a repulsive organization. So what exactly are we raising awareness for? The other question is, okay, within climate action, are we working on mitigation or are we working on adaptation? And there's a huge difference between the two, as I'm sure you are all aware. Climate change mitigation involves tackling the causes and possibly minimizing the impacts of climate change, but we have to tackle the causes of climate change, versus climate change adaptation looks at reducing the negative effects that climate change will have. So then what do we do in the region? Which one do we focus on? And then, of course, that goes back to who are we in the region? Because West Asia is a huge plot of land. We're talking about very diverse countries. So the answer to, do we work on climate change mitigation or climate change adaptation, in my opinion, depends, do you consider yourself part of the global north or part of the global south? Because we have pockets of the global north in West Asia, as well as we have larger pockets of the global south in West Asia. So what are the challenges facing us in West Asia? What are the challenges that we have? Okay, what do we know about climate change in West Asia? We know that at best, this is the good case scenario, rainfall will dramatically decline. We've seen this happen in Syria with 7 to 8 years of consecutive drought that contributed to massive problems in agriculture, that then further contributed to massive problems in economics, all of which were magnified, of course, by a neoliberal economic plan that the Syrian government had imposed. So we know that climate change has already contributed to a decline in rainfall, leading to an increase in drought. We know also that climate change will increase desertification throughout the region. And we know, of course, that climate change will make the gloriously warm temperatures in the Arabian Gulf a little bit more hellish than they already are. And I'm saying this as somebody who was raised in Bahrain, and we used to joke in Bahrain that we have 3 seasons, spring, summer, and hell. So the season of hell in Bahrain would definitely be enlarged. But these are the best case scenarios of climate change that we are living in today. But another critical aspect of climate change, particularly for those of us who are concerned about the justice aspect of it, is that climate change is a multiplier. It makes every negative challenge you have in your country worse. So we have a public health crisis. It will magnify the public health crisis because we know of the direct and indirect impacts of climate change on public health. We have a water crisis, which we have throughout the region. Some of the causes of our water crisis in West Asia are environmental, and many of the causes of the water crisis in our region are actually economic and political. but climate change will make that a lot worse. We're having tensions among individuals, it will make that a lot worse. And we're not even talking here about the many glorious non-human animals with whom we are blessed to share this earth with. And we rarely talk about the non-human animals. What will be the multiplier effect on them, given that we have massively decreased biodiversity around the world? And so climate change will also have an impact on that. So we are dealing with dramatic impacts of climate change on our region. I'm sure many of us know that, but what else do we know about the region? We have countries that have been devastated by war. We look at Yemen, we look at Iraq, we look at Syria. We also have countries that are currently still devastated by occupation and apartheid. And here I mean the historic lands of Palestine. And by historic lands, I am referring to all of Palestine. I do not consider Palestine to be simply the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza, but all the lands of Palestine that are suffering from more than 70 years of occupation and apartheid. We have that happening in one part of our region. We also, and we need to recognize this, we have other countries in our region that are actively supporting those war crimes. We know that the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain have open support of Israel, which means that they are then complicit in the occupation and apartheid of Palestinians. We also know that the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia are leading, and I'm being very conservative in my language here, leading the war against Yemen. So of course, they are also then complicit in that war crime. And let me not even begin about the involvement of many countries in the region in the war on Syria. So here again, we have situations where we have the victims and the victimizers, okay? And of course, I'm not in any way excusing the Palestinian Authority for their crimes or excusing the other regimes in the country for their crimes. But we need to recognize we have wars that are being imposed on people in the region by other people in the region. We also have a vast difference in per capita consumption. So while we have countries along the Eastern Mediterranean that are facing increased poverty, while of course we still have the uber rich in the country, that as anywhere in the world, the uber rich continue to get rich while the poor continue to get poor and the middle class gets decimated, we also have some of the highest per capita consumptions in the world in our region. Some of the highest ecological footprints in the world in our region. Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates have very high ecological footprints. So then when we go back to adaptation and mitigation, it cannot be the same solution throughout the region because we are vastly different. And then there's the bigger question. Can we even mitigate or adapt within our current economic systems? And unfortunately, the vast majority of the world, with the exception of a few countries in South America, pockets of a few other systems around the world, but the vast majority of the countries in the world suffer under the same economic system, the neoliberal capitalist economic system. Can we even seek to adapt and to mitigate within this capitalistic system? And I argue absolutely not, because capitalism is by design built on the concept of constant growth, which is a concept that violates the laws of thermodynamics. So those of us that are ecologists, those of us that recognizes the value of science, we must therefore recognize the irrationality of capitalism, because we cannot have an economic system that is designed on constant growth within an environmental world that is built along finite growth. It simply violates the laws of thermodynamics. We have another problem with capitalism, which is it is built on the concept of disposability. We dispose of people within the capitalistic system because there is a certain percentage of humans that have to remain unemployed so that we can continue to profit off their labor. More importantly, we regard all aspects of environmental pollution as simple externalities. We throw it out. And the only means of measurements between individuals is the profit measure, okay? While we continue to make more and to make more and to make more. This is the capitalistic design. And this is exactly what has been the lead contributor and the lead cause of climate change, is capitalism. So can we seek to mitigate within the same economic system? Can we seek to mitigate or to adapt within the political systems that we have in our region? Our political systems throughout the region, with absolutely no exception, are non-democratic. We do not have equality among citizens. We do not have respect for our citizens and all our residents, because all the people need to be respected, nor do we have real respect for the earth and the other biotic species that live with us. So within this political system, can we even work our way forward toward mitigation and adaptation? And if your answer is like mine, which is no, this economic system and this political system cannot be pathways forward if we really want to transform the destruction that has been caused over the past 100 plus years, the question then becomes, how do we do climate action that is truly transformative and that builds a different economy and a different politics and a different way of thinking, a completely different perception? Do we have that courage to be so imaginative where we build forward and we build something vastly different than capitalism? Or are we simply going to limit our imagination to what kinds of trees can we plant with more drought, and how do we use less water, and how do we recycle plastic, which of course becomes one of the biggest acts of greenwashing, this concept of recycling plastic, and we can talk about that later. I was asked to also talk about the relationship between militarism and capitalism, or actually militarism and climate change, but they are one and the same. In a region that has been devastated by wars, and I want to say this for the record, that our region is not an exception. I wish that we were special. I wish that we were exceptional with regards to the horrors that we have faced, but quite unfortunately, we are not exceptional. We can look at the horrors that the communities throughout South America have faced for hundreds of years, and the greater horrors that communities throughout continental Africa have faced and continue to face for hundreds of years. And as our colleagues in North America know, the indigenous communities of Canada are still facing horrors because they are still uncovering mass graves of their children, recognizing that these children are still, until today, victims of colonization in Canada. Okay, so I just want to put that up front, that we Arabs are not exceptional, not as being victims of occupation or victims of sectarianism or victims of colonialism or victims of apartheid. We are not exceptional, nor are we exceptional in ourselves being perpetrators of colonialism and apartheid and occupation. So with that in mind, how do we look at militarism? With the exception of civil wars, and not all civil wars, with the exception of some civil wars, every single external war, every single armed conflict outside of one's national borders have been designed for the exploitation of resources, period. So therefore, militarism cannot be separated from the economic system itself. It simply cannot. Militarism becomes the arm of capitalism. We see this exquisitely clear by the United States, which is the only country whose currency is not supported by gold because it is backed by their army that is present around the world. So we see this intricate relationship between militarism and capitalism, which then leads us to argue that if we really want to work for climate justice, then we have to be anti-militaristic, which means we have to be anti-imperialist, not only to be anti-capitalist, but also anti-imperialist and anti-militarism, which also means we have to be anti-sanctions. And I say this because there are sanctions right now being imposed on Syria. There are different kinds of sanctions being imposed on Yemen. And of course, there are sanctions being imposed on Libya. Of course, there are also sanctions being imposed on Venezuela and Cuba and other parts of the world. And sanctions have become this new tactic presented as a diplomatic tactic, which is nothing other than collective punishment of a population in order to get a change in their governmental policy. And that change in the governmental policy has nothing to do with democracy and human rights and everything to do with further exploitation of resources. So I'm throwing all of these issues together because they are together. They are connected. Okay, so even if we are going to be working on adaptation in our region, and one clear way of working for adaptation in our region is shifting our agricultural system and developing an agricultural system that is really based on ecological mindfulness, which means we know what to plant and we know when to plant it and we know with what to plant it. So we step away from monoculture, we step back into agroecology, and we recognize that our climate is changing and we resurrect our indigenous plants, okay? How do we do that within the same economic system? How do we do that in Iraq, for example? In Iraq, which was the real breadbasket of the world, which is where wheat was originally found. How do we allow Iraqi farmers to recognize the mass genetic diversity that is present and that is still found in seed banks particularly the seed bank in Aleppo, okay, so that they can replant the proper kind of wheats. How do we do that within an economic system that is pushing seeds from Monsanto, which are predominantly terminal seeds and suicide seeds that push for a monoculture system? So here we have a relationship between liberating our agriculture is tied to liberating our economy. We have numerous other examples with regards to planting that we need to be looking at. We also have examples regarding to public health. If we are working on adaptation, what does that mean today when we are facing a pandemic, the COVID pandemic, and we know for a fact, without a shred of doubt, as has been revealed by numerous scientists and numerous epidemiologists, that the COVID pandemic is caused by an evolutionary breakdown. It is directly linked to the kind of agriculture that we have been participating in and directly linked to the destruction of biodiversity that we are all culprits of and all guilty of in various degrees. So here we are seeing one consequence of our environmental destruction, which is the COVID pandemic, but we are also seeing something else happening during the COVID pandemic, which is this kind of vaccine nationalism in its most ugly form. And the way forward with regards to the COVID pandemic is to internationalize the vaccine, to make sure that the vaccine is available to all countries and not to have the vaccine being available as it is now, where we have certain countries having a higher percentage of vaccination and other countries not getting anything vaccinated. So what I'm saying here is there's a direct relationship between public health, which means public health to be available and provided for all the residents and citizens without exception. There's a direct relationship between public health as an adaptation to climate change, because we know what climate change will do to our public health. We know of the risks of climate change to our public health, but there's a relationship between public health and pharmaceutical lobbying and economic systems. There is that relationship. So how do we adapt our public health system to make it egalitarian, to make it just, to make it available for all without liberating our economy from the pharmaceutical lobbyist? How do we do that? If you have an answer to that, that would be great. But how do we learn from the failure of worldwide negotiations on the COVID pandemic in building our negotiations forward with regards to climate change, given that the big difference between climate change and COVID is there is no vaccine for climate change, and there is a vaccine for COVID. So these are some ways that we can talk about adaptation. But what about mitigation? There's a difference, and there's two viewpoints scientifically. Several years ago, I mean, back when I was teaching climate change at the University of Balaman, this was 6-7 years ago, there were a group of scientists that were arguing that we have reached the tipping point, that we have already reached the tipping point. If we're going to take that scientific evidence forward, then we're past the point of no return on mitigation. If we're going to say, okay, no, we still have some time left, and perhaps maybe we can mitigate forward, then what would that mitigation actually look like? Are we going to stop using our cars and start using electric cars? Is that our method of mitigation? Which is, instead of eating with my right hand, I eat with my left hand? Because what do electric cars run on? Electricity. And what is electricity fueled by? So what are we actually doing? Shall we continue to produce plastic, but just increase the recycling of plastic, knowing for sure, of course, that one of the components of plastic is fuel? So here, when we think about mitigation, real mitigation, we have to be transformative in the way we look at mitigation, which means it's not an issue of private car, a car run by fossil fuel and a car run by electricity. But we are talking about, let's get rid of private cars and let's actually be imaginative on our public transportation. Let's think about something vastly different. In one of the webinars that you had, Ryan, you brought up the fossil fuel in the Mediterranean, not fossil fuel, actually the gas in the Mediterranean, that certain Lebanese politicians are so excited by. Oh my God, we've got the gas, okay, which is insane. And we can have two positions here. One position could be leave the gas in the sea, which of course is a position that ecologists support. Let's leave the gas in the sea. Let's leave the fossil fuel for where it belongs, in the soil. And if we are going to be pushing for that as a platform of mitigation, then it becomes the direct ethical and financial and political responsibility of all the countries of the global north, and I mean global north economically and not geographically, becomes their responsibility to support those countries that are choosing to keep fossil fuel in the ground and the gas in the sea. to support them further on issues of rights and not privileges, which means on issues of public health, on issues of public education, on issues of economic transformation, so on and so forth. Even if that gas were to be used from the sea, which I am firmly opposed to using that gas, the big question becomes, what will it be used for? So even if we are going to continue to develop our fossil fuel, what are we using that for? To build a further consumptive lifestyle so we can continue to have a television in every room in the Gulf? Or shall we actually be using that fossil fuel for a transformative economy? And if we are going to use it for a transformative economy, guess what? We don't need it, because we can really be transformative without it, tremendously. I just want to end with this. I mean, as somebody who is fundamentally anti-capitalist, and when I speak about a world without capitalism, the response that I get from a lot of people is, I'm dreaming, and I might as well be dreaming about walking to the moon. And I am reminded of a quote by one of the leading science fiction writers who said that during the time of the monarchies in Europe, no one dreamed in Europe that we would be living at a time when the royal families would not be blessed with divine right to rule over us, within the feudal monarchy system. But the monarchies have failed, they have fallen. No one claims that kings have divine right over us. So if they can fall, capitalism can fall. And we are really at a stage where we either hold on to this destructive economic system and therefore hold on to the extinction of more than 80% of the non-human animals and plants that are around us. And as well, what James Lovelock argues, the killing and the murder of approximately 80% of humans. Or we can be imaginative and courageous and step beyond an economic system that is built on constant consumption and infinite growth, and think about an economic system that is built on degrowth, which is growing, the degrowth movement in Europe. Think about an economic system that respects indigenous rights, and let us learn back from the indigenous communities throughout the region, throughout our whole world, that for thousands of years, thousands and thousands of years, knew how to live with the environment instead of living on top of and dispossessing of the environment. I believe we have no choice but to transform our world, because climate change will definitely be transforming it. So let's figure out how to transform it in a less destructive and a more community-based fashion than the way that we are having now. And I very much hope that I've thrown a lot of questions at each other where we can begin to think about these questions forward and think about climate action within a really revolutionary perspective of climate justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Rania. That was really nice. I won't give my personal opinion on the topic. I want everybody to be here. I just want to say that part of us teaching youth to speak up about environmental issues is real talk. Talk the real talk that needs to be spoken, as Rania spoke today. Yes, we do have to talk about politics sometimes. We need to talk about the capitalistic system, the economy, the ruling class. We need to, So as Youth for Nature, as an organization trying to create youth who are leaders and stewards, please do follow the tracks of how Rania just mentioned, the political system, the economic system, and all of these things. Not saying that you need to agree, just saying that you need to speak the truth as it is. Because much often what's happening with youth is that they're trying to focus on individual habits. Let me change my diet. Let me plant more trees in my garden because politics is too blurry. And you need to talk about it. It is what it is. This is the only way, as Rania was saying, to create transformative change from the source. And you need to talk about politics, the economy, the ruling class. I didn't ask anybody to put their questions in the chat. Rania already mentioned some questions. You don't need to focus on that. You are open now to freely discuss what Rania mentioned. You're free to discuss what Nishad spoke in his episode, what Lama and Ala spoke, and what Suha spoke in their episodes. I hope you've all watched the episodes. This is an open space. Please raise your hand and start asking. No need to write it in the chat. If you feel like you want to write it, and I can read it for you. But please, anybody who would like to start commenting, please just raise your hand and step forward. You're very welcome. And I can summarize later what Rania was mentioning. Please go ahead and start, Nishad. And anybody after Nishad, just raise your hand and ask the questions and we'll start. All right.
Well, I will start from where Rania stopped. Absolutely a wonderful explanation of how it looks like. Something you should take away is most of like the definition of MENA, and most of the time how people have been perceived of this region as one, and all the negotiation is one big, continent as such, MENA, which is absolutely, I love how she started, because that's how the most of the discussion happens in the global north when they see, oh, where the young people from the MENA. It's not a continent. It's actually a division of countries with multilateralism, so much of politics on the ground. Fortunately, for most of the people comes from one big, large faith, but divided between sects and tribes and etc. And it has its own implication at the local, regional, and global scale. And this has been quite forgotten. That's why some of the times, that's why young people from the region are super underrepresented. They just say, hey, MENA, and pick a couple from the North Africa, and they said, hey, MENA is represented. And that's how it's been historically done at our global North friends, especially the youth movement. Again, I'm a big fan of Creta and others, but it's been taken by, again, the wide group of young people and undermined, global South young from Asia. Of course, MENA also. Why would MENA countries being considered? And hey, there are many rich countries. The oil and gas by monarchy-based countries have a larger wealth, but go beyond. People never flourish beyond that. So sometimes there's, why do you have to include young people from the Gulf? They all make a lot of money. Not absolutely no. A few of them makes a lot of money, and it's not evenly distributed. So these disputes have been not known. Even the fact, I just recall an incident back in 2019 when I met a couple of the young, so-called young people from the Fridays for Future. They were asking Nishad to organize a Fridays for Future in Doha. They don't know Friday is an official holiday, and walking to a parliament is constitutionally forbidden for anybody to do. That's the understanding they don't understand. I'm like, I cannot go, Friday is a holiday, and I march towards the parliament. On the way, I would be arrested and put in jail. So these are the things they don't understand. So even the youth movement lack the real understanding of what they are looking at, and they don't look at the collaboration, rather than this is a disintegrated movement. These days, like I said, the organization like Youth for Nature are coming to this region, and having a person who's part of the region, who understands the region to lead, which is quite very. Sometimes you see some of the organization, somebody sit in New York and dictate the MENA region, which is absolutely rubbish to me. And it's been changing. It's a good sort of how things do. I'm just terming 4 years back when I started the climate movement, part of being the climate movement. So there's been a drastic shift, but you need to know that the region is different, and why historically young people are undermined, thanks to the political systems here and the absolute monarchy systems here, had also to do with that, because most of the time youth were represented by the government youth. So they've been the youth in the negotiation. And also, all the United Nations negotiation also happens within the government to government, whether it is democratic or non-democratic, it doesn't matter to them. So ideally, my sort of understanding is that the young people from the region are undermined, of course, by the global north, and has to be given more space and voices to do in the coming days. Else, given the fact this region already been going through a lot of sufferings and stuff, they wouldn't be not really caring that, rather than getting some food on the table for the family and themselves, because they're going through so much of poverty, and the region has been super disintegrated, war. They also have a lot of civil wars in the countries, and also some of the regional conflict, which is quite noisy, including the Palestinian issues as such. So if you ask somebody there, you do want to fight for climate change, they really don't understand that this fact is a climate change fight, because the farming land's been lost. Those things are not discussed in a very, very deep way. I'm glad I'm hearing Rania for the first time. I absolutely love how you put that in the context, and I don't think there are many persons like you who brings up that sort of connections, how things due to monarchy and colonialism, and also how capitalism works. So I'm glad that you brought up those stuff, which is absolutely necessary. I don't know how I missed you in the past. I'm glad Ryan brought you up to, at least to me, on the mainstream here. So looking forward for more conversation. And I know many young people here who have been part of ever since some of the climate movements happened. Like Lama has also been quite a good friend of mine, and Ryan, ever since I know him through Youth for Nature. There are a lot of young people coming out. Of course, a space is required, platform is required, and I think they should keep up, and also more voices to be given to least, like Rania mentioned, who does the least. I mean, I wouldn't call a person from Yemen and say, "Hey, you are the culprit. You know, you are part of the region, and you have to do." No, I mean, they're not anywhere in the discussion, but they're going through a civil war. But they are the people who have to be given the space, because they are the one who deeply suffers. You know, that is something is regionally not very distributed, and people are okay to have some good speakers in the name of speakers sometimes, not really understanding what is going through on the ground realities sometimes.
Nishat, if you don't mind, I mean, for me, I cannot talk about Yemen in any way without recognizing how I am guilty of what is happening in Yemen, because as a Lebanese, there are certain Lebanese politicians that are supporting the Saudi funding of the massacres against Yemen. So, you know, I have to always know where I am and where I stand and what I am asking of others. And even climate justice and climate action, what does it really mean? And I cannot separate it from economic liberation and political liberation, because it is a direct consequence of the economic destruction and the political destruction that many of us have been guilty of or victims of for decades and generations. Ibrahim asked this question on Facebook that I want to bring into the discussion, because I think it's the heart and core of our discussions. When Ibrahim asks, what about the developing countries that their GDP solely depends on the fossil fuel economy? How do you think we can transform this by agroforestry and regenerative agroecology? I think the first problem is still depending on GDP. GDP is a false indicator. When we look at the gross domestic product, and we think that a GDP is going to be in any way an indicator of economic health or of environmental health, then we have a problem right then and there. So the first thing we have to do is toss out the GDP, because the GDP denies environmental health. It views that as an externality to its own issue. The GDP even goes so much further and says that landfill, so if I cause an explosion and I kill people, okay, and the consequence of that explosion is we then have to destroy more mountains through mountaintop removal or through quarry removal to get more rubble to rebuild, that's a positive thing in the GDP. The destruction actually becomes a positive thing because it resulted in some kind of a construction. You know, so the GDP itself is a terrible, terrible indicator. We need to step away from that first and foremost. Okay, so once we've got that out of the way, then the question becomes, how do we transform our economies out of this dependence on fossil fuel and into something else? And here there's a range of questions that I want to ask, which is, what is our economy for? And these are really big philosophical questions. What is our economy for? Are we building an economy so that we, the people, can live with humility and with dignity? Or are we building an economy so that we can continue to produce and to consume? And there's a big difference between the two. If I am thinking about an economy whose sole objective is to continue to produce so that I can continue to consume, so that I can continue to compete with other countries around the world, then I am bound to simply go from one destructive economic format to another destructive economic format. And I can come up with a destructive economic form of communism, or even a destructive economic form of socialism. But if I want to take it further and say an economy is here to serve the people, not the people to serve the economy, and an economy is here to recognize that the first question is always, what are the environmental limits of growth? And we start there, then I'm thinking about a whole different kind of economy, an economy that would be much closer to the Cuban model. And I'm a huge fan of the Cuban model and the amazing wonder that has happened in Cuba, where despite the sanctions, despite the destruction of the cruel and criminal US sanctions on Cuba that have been going on for more than 50 years, the Cubanos were able to develop the most efficient agricultural system in the world, the most efficient agricultural system. They were able to transform their economy from their agriculture from one that primarily produces sugar to one that produces a range of fruits and vegetables and products for themselves. Now, of course, they were pushed to do that production because of sanctions, but they proved that they were capable of doing that. So the only agricultural system that we need to be looking at is one that recognizes the laws of nature, that recognizes the intrinsic importance of biodiversity, that recognizes the laws of the soil, which means what I take out of the soil, I need to bring back into the soil, that steps away from a fossil fuel form of agriculture, which is dependent on fertilizers that are made from fossil fuel, dependent on pesticides that are also toxic, and goes back to a natural form of fertilizer where we fertilize our soil with chicken poop, and the chicken poop are related to the cows, and so on and so forth. And we build that natural model of agriculture, which can only be an agroforestry regenerative agroecological model. And we can do that, but it would take us first to step away from the GDP model. And it would take us first to look at, even if we are going to be using our fossil fuels, we can only use them as a transition forward, so that we use them to invest locally in local agriculture and then stop them. But even that, we don't really need it. So I am asking for a really courageous mode of agriculture, a really courageous mode of economy. We can do this in our region. So for example, let me give you a concrete example. One of the main uses of fossil fuel in Saudi Arabia, the main expenditure of fossil fuel in Saudi Arabia is air conditioning. Okay, which is completely ludicrous. As many of us that grew up in the Gulf know, if we go back to building our homes in the manner that they were built before we remove the carbon from the soil, we would not need such air conditioning. We would not be using such air conditioning. If we just go back and restore the architectural models of our homes in the Gulf, we would save 50% of the fossil fuel expenditure in Saudi Arabia, right then and there. So here I am asking for us to go back and learn what has been our history, what can we learn from our own indigenous communities, and how can we courageously step away from using fossil fuel? Particularly if I'm going to be extremely cynical about this, the oil will run out, and then what are we going to do? So either we transition now or we transition by force later on. But there are models available. There are models available, even if we don't want to adopt the Cuban model, which I hope we do. But there are other models available. I hope that answers your question, Brahim, and please let me know if that did not answer your question.
Perfect. Thank you so much on that intervention. B, would you like ask your question, or would you like me to? And Lama, also feel free to intervene on the topic, because it's about Syria specifically. Gabi? Okay, cool. I will read it. So Lama, feel free to intervene on this first, and then anybody can intervene after you. So it's so great to hear you, Rania. Gabi's learning a lot. She has a question about Rojava in northern Syria. And they're trying to build what they call an ecological society using a different democratic system, the democratic confederalism. Do you know about this? Do you have any information about how this has happened? What do you think about it, especially that there is more pressure from Turkey? Lama, have you heard about this? Do you have any opinions or not? Let us know.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ryan, and thank you, Rania, for this really wonderful point that you talked about today. I'm really happy, like personally, I learned a lot today. For the question that Gabi asked, to be honest, I read about it and I know it's a theory. I'm not sure if it's implemented in Northeast Syria. I know about it from my work in Northeast Syria. But my work is not really related to environment in that part of the world. So I know it's a theory created to like basically try to solve the problems that the Northeast Syria face from a drought, from the economic situation now. It's really difficult there, and try to solve it through this model, which actually trying to educate people about their relationship with the nature, and then after educating them, trying to create or introduce this model of living with their environment. But I don't know much details about it, and I really be happy to hear anyone if you know any information about this project and if it's actually implemented, because as far as I know, it's just a theory. I don't know if it's implemented. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot. Does anybody else have an opinion regarding this specifically? If not, I have something to intervene on. Cool. All right, cool. Please feel free to raise your hand again or put it in the chat and we'll keep on answering. Rania, and I'll read this directly off my phone, all right? Just yesterday, I was reading something from a consultant at the Ministry of Energy in Saudi Arabia. So when we're talking about all of these things, the transformative change, dropping fossil fuels, going back to our roots, and then I come and I read something like the world's largest carbon utilization facility done in Saudi Arabia, approved funding, increasing renewables from 1 to 50% in 9 years, never done before. The world's first carbon neutral major city, NEOM's line, 1 million inhabitants. And it goes, so on and so forth. The world's first batch of blue ammonia, first or largest green hydrogen production, lowest cost of solar energy on the planet in Saudi Arabia. Over 10 million smart electronic meters installed in less than 2 years, never happened before. The world's biggest reforestation project, 50 billion trees. What do we say about this?
I say two quick things. I'm always worried when people plant trees, by the way, and my PhD was in forestry. So you would think that I would be like, yes, plant trees, but because the first question is which trees were planted? And that is a really, really big question. One of the most common trees to be planted in our region, because people love this, is the eucalyptus tree, because it grows so fast. But wait a second, if we are dealing with a region like ours, that it ranges from dry to arid to temperate, and we are having a fast growing tree, then what is that tree doing to water absorption, and what is that tree doing to other trees around the region? So please do not plant eucalyptus in our region, because it is extremely destructive to other plants and to the soil. So planting trees, what trees, where, how, etc., etc. The devil is in the details. With regards to everything else that they stated, it makes me laugh, because it's as if renewable energy costs the environment nothing. It's as if the solution is renewable energy. Renewable energy within a capitalistic system is still a problem. Where are we going to get the minerals to fuel the solar power? They're just going to fall like the sun, or are we going to be extracting them also from the earth? And from which countries will we be extracting the lithium and the other battery powers that we need for our solar power, so on and so forth? From which countries? Predominantly from continental Africa. And what will happen to those communities? So the solution, if we really want to be honest about it, the solution is not simply to go from fossil fuel electricity to solar power and maintain everything else is the same, because even solar power costs the environment something. The solution is to reduce energy consumption, to dramatically reduce energy consumption, and within the reduction of energy consumption, to be using renewable energy. But I will not simply be transforming one form of energy to the other. We know this in the United States when they first started selling and proposing, and Al Gore, one of the biggest problems with the movie An Inconvenient Truth was how he ended it with change your light bulb. Slumly, change your light bulb. Okay, this has been proven economically and scientifically that when you give me a light bulb that uses less energy, you know what I do? I keep it on for longer. So I actually end up using the same amount of energy. So here the objective should be for our politicians to be courageous, which I will be very blunt. The vast majority of politicians around the world lack the courage upfront. Okay, there's only a handful of them, predominantly in this magnificent group called Progressive International, that I urge you all to join, a magnificent group of politicians and leaders from around the world. But they lack the courage to truly be transformative, so they're willing to sacrifice our children and their own children as a consequence. The solution is not to maintain the same energy consumption, but to get it from a different source and to maintain a capitalistic economy. So no, what the Saudi Arabians are doing, the Saudi Arabian government is doing is very funny. And it reminds me of what the United Arab Emirates is doing with let us be green by having these other false islands that we are, planting. And it's insane. It really, really is insane. It is a perfect example of greenwashing. And we need to have the courage to step away from it, because we are truly talking about the destruction of our planet. And unless we want to do what Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are doing and get on a rocket and go to another planet, We need to have the courage to change the very system that we are part of. The alternative is simple: capitalism and death, or a different economic format. It's just, I cannot be more blunt than that. And yes, thank you for posting the link for Progressive International.
Thank you so much. Let's stay tuned, because Nishad and I will talk about Masdar City and the United Arab Emirates coming soon, though, coming soon. Lama, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ryan. I actually have a question for Dr. Rania. So one of the issues that we face, that the everyday people, or the ordinary people who are the majority of, they are not the majority of our communities. Let's say I actually want, I represent the ordinary people who I am a concerned ordinary people, because I read about climate change and I try to do as much as I can. But in general, how we can actually, a question for you, Rania, and for the rest of you attending this seminar, is how we can transfer this information to the ordinary people, to everyday person in the street, because I don't think they have this knowledge. In the same time, I believe that they have the wisdom to do what is right, or what they think it's right for their life. But in general, I don't think they have this information that help to make this transformation to other system or other economical model. So it would be really, help me so I can help others. Because I struggle with that. I struggle when I want to explain climate change, or the impact of climate change, and how we can take actions on a daily basis with for the general public, let's say.
It's a fantastic question, Laman, and I have a slew of different answers. The first way is, I don't talk about climate change at all. It doesn't resonate with people. Instead, I talk about access to water, or I talk about which apple trees do we want to plant. Which orange trees do we want to plant? Can we continue to plant our orange trees? I come up with something that people can touch, they can understand. We understand what drought is. We understand what thirst is. We understand what it means when we cannot plant what we are used to planting. What will happen to our za'atar? What will happen to our nana? What will happen to the trees that are indigenous to our cuisine? Okay, I start with what people know, and then I say, okay, so if we are concerned about water, then let us not build this dam. Dams are still extraordinarily popular in our region, although there is no scientific reason to have the vast majority of dams that they've been having. So I come up with another option instead of this. I don't talk about, for example, the methane that is exploding from our landfills in Saida and Lebanon, and present the relationship between the methane explosion and climate change. It's way too complicated. Instead, I talk about the glory of chickens, and how if we simply grow a chicken, raise a chicken in your backyard, and then you know that 50% of our waste in Lebanon is compost, throw that remaining food into your backyard. If you're blessed by not living in Beirut, then you have a backyard, and raise some chickens. And we just decreased our waste 50%. And guess what? You just got some really high protein eggs. And, so coming up with alternatives that resonate with people's lives today, that becomes one thing that's critical. The other thing that I suggest is we have to be organizing economically and politically, which means we join unions. If we don't have unions, then we join cooperatives and we build cooperatives. But we have to be active economically on the ground. For those of us that live in countries that this is possible, we also join political parties, or we build political parties, because we need holistic alternatives. We need to think big picture. So for me, to deal with the climate crisis in Lebanon means I need to build a public transportation system. We have to do that. The same would apply to Syria. We need a decent public transportation system. Both Lebanon and Syria are suffering from a fuel crisis. Both Lebanon and Syria are suffering from agricultural crises. So what would that mean in terms of cooperatives, in terms of farmers, in terms of organizing? But the terms climate change and climate justice and environmental justice do not resonate linguistically with us. We don't need to use them. So I would suggest that we come up with examples and with actions that resonate immediately with people's lives, and that we also start to organize for the medium and long term, which means union organizing, workers' rights, cooperatives, and progressive political parties.
Thank you very much, Rania.
Thanks a lot. All right. Well, the discussion, I'd say, is going really good. We are kind of running out of time, so if anybody has more questions, please pop it up now. I'll ask one while we wait for another question. We talked a lot about geopolitics, differences in West Asia, and economic and political spheres. I just want to pop a question. For us to get rid of all of these issues, is it okay to agree to disagree? Is there a way we can work with each other, not against each other, knowing that wars have fueled more hatred because, once there's blood, you cannot deny that. So is the Palestinian cause, so are the wars happening in Iraq, Syria, Yemen. How can we move past that, especially us as youth? How can we move past that? Is there a model for West Asia that can be applied as youth so that we don't have to go through that very hard political, economic, dilemma? Is there an easier way for us to collaborate?
If I could answer that, Rayan, if you would allow me. I don't mind working across political lines, but I do mind vehemently working with any individual that does not recognize the rights for liberation for all Palestinians. So here there are red lines that I would draw. So even, and I say this because I have been contacted by many organizations for decades to work on climate change issues or to work on environmental change issues and to set the occupation of Palestine aside as we organize. So no, absolutely not, because this is integral. So, this is a firm red line. And that red line, I would argue, would also apply to other issues of war and militarization and racism and colonization. They cannot be separated. It's as if I'm being asked to work on women's rights, but not talk about domestic violence. So they are integral. And I firmly believe that when we organize, there is strength when we refuse to accept crumbs. There is strength when we say these are our rights and not our privileges, and we have the right to live in dignity with our heritage. And I should not have to choose between my right for liberation and my right for clean water and my right for clean air and the right of the other animals that I live with to continue to live on this earth. We should never ask each other to choose amongst them. Now, does that mean that I will not organize with capitalists? Okay, I hope to. I mean, I don't like to, but we can be organizing with them on small points so that they can then see the bigger picture. But let us please be careful in our organizing not to participate in any greenwashing, in any pinkwashing, in any military washing, because that is actually more destructive to our struggle than not action. So let's just see the big picture while we're doing this. If we are to compromise, to know what we compromise on, and to know why we are compromising on the issues that we are compromising on, while we build for something that is transformative and egalitarian. But we should never be compromising on liberation and freedom. And therefore, I do not work with any organization or any individual that violates the guidelines of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, as you know from the questions that I asked you when I joined the webinar. And these are key. These are not extraneous. They are fundamental issues that are integral to the struggle for justice, because ultimately this is a struggle for justice.
Thank you so much for answering that. I just wanted to note something I forgot at the beginning, is that we didn't purposefully forget about the Iraqi struggle. For any person speaking to us from Iraq, we were just highlighting as examples in Syria and Yemen. This does not mean that, we are disregarding struggles happening in Lebanon, in Iraq, and in other neighboring countries. So we're all in this together. We are representing everybody equally. Are there any further questions by anybody? Stuart, anybody on Facebook popping up? Any new questions before we give a closing and end this amazing discussion? Anybody would like to comment on something or ask something? All right, cool. All right, Rania, would you like to add something or good?
I just would like to thank you all for this opportunity and to really encourage us to be courageous in the positions that we take, and to do all that we can, and to join a political movement wherever you are, if you are living in a country that allows you the space to do so. And again, thank you for this opportunity, and I hope to remain in touch with you all, and onwards always.
Thank you for this journey of a learning experience, very specific to West Asia. This discussion is much needed. Promise we will have more of this on the podcast. In a further webinar, we can discuss this further. I just wanted to let everybody know we did this in English because the international audience needs to learn about these things in English. And so I hope everybody learned something very specific about West Asia, although Rania mentioned that we're not special, we're not unique with our struggles, but we did want to highlight what is happening exactly in West Asia, the struggles youth are facing, the challenges that we have, and the solutions, the real solutions that are needed to create a transformative change from the source. Thank you all so much for joining. Thank you for staying longer than I promised, but I'm sure it was all worth it. Thank you, Rania. Thank you, Nisha. Thank you, Lama. Thank you, Ala and Suha. If you're gonna watch it later, thank you too. All right. Well, thank you so much. We'll be in touch with everybody, and see you later. All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, Ryan. Bye-bye, all.
Bye.